I think Charlene's colleague is going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've done in relation to biblical interpretation. So I'm going to talk much more about how the Bible and its images have been used for both the oppression and exclusion of people with disabilities, but also how some of the interpreters with experiences of disability have been able to reframe some of those images. So a number of years ago, I wrote a book called Sense and Stigma in the Gospels. And this very much looked at the ways in which the Bible and its texts and its metaphors and its images in any way kind of contributed to stigmatizing or discrimination against people with disabilities. So ableism, the prejudice that non-disabled people often have towards certain different conditions, has, I think, been sustained by some biblical material. So, for instance, in the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, people with disabilities are disallowed to participate in the temple cult. So this is what Leviticus 21 says. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and say, no one of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish may approach to offer the food of his God. No one who has a blemish shall draw near, not one who is blind or lame, one who has a mutilated face or limb too long, one who has a broken foot or a broken hand or a hunchback or a dwarf or a man with blemish in his eyes or an itching disease or scabs or crushed testicles. No descendant of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near to offer the Lord's offerings by fire. Since he has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer the food of his God. He may eat the food of his God, of the most holy, as well as of the holy, but he cannot enter that sacred space." There's also within the Bible kind of images of sin and evil being appropriated onto disabled characters. So for the Gospel of John, when the disciples and Jesus see someone who is blind, the disciples ask Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man, his parents, that he was born blind?" And there are also ways in which disability metaphors are used to kind of show spiritual ineptitude, doubt, or misguided leadership. So blind guides, people unable to share in God's wisdom. Are often the discourses of disability go around these very negative, very discriminatory kind of texts. There's also a sense in which the Bible healing narratives of Jesus, one of the key sort of insights from a man called John Hull, who was a blind New Testament scholar, said that there was almost like the assumption that cure had to happen. Why was there not disabled characters that could remain in that identity within the early Christian movement? As the gospel tells it, Jesus's kind of role is to make the blind see, the deaf hear, the lepers be cleansed, and the dead to be raised and the good news brought to them. But why is that cure so central? And because of that, I think the Bible has quite rightly, or biblical interpretation has been part of ableism, and it has had ableist undertones. A lady called Deborah Creamer sums this up quite well. She says, when disabilities have been considered at all in the Bible, they have all historically been looked at either as symbols of sin to be avoided, images of saintliness or virtuous suffering to be admired, or signs of God's power over particular conditions. She says very rarely are people with disabilities in the Bible considered first as people. And one of the ways in which Charlene has done a lot more work in this area than I have, but it's something we want to try and develop in this project, is biblical texts that have been used for good and ill and oppression and exclusion, but also liberation, often find their liberating voice when voices of experience of particular oppressions are able to comment on them. And finding a solidarity between experience and biblical texts is really, really important. And in disability theology, there has been a move to actually identify not just with characters in biblical texts, but actually look at the character of God as somebody, rather than with all the abilities that we often ascribe in theology to God, actually a God crucified or a God disabled. And Nancy Iceland wrote a very powerful book in the 1990s called The Disabled God, in which she saw God as a survivor. She said that Jesus, as somebody that bears the marks of scarred flesh from the crucifixion, she says in very many ways identifies with bodies that are marked as other. And here I'm going to quote her what she says. She says, "The resurrected Jesus, in presenting impaired hands and feet, a side to be touched by frightened friends, alters taboos of physical avoidance of disability and calls followers to reconsider their connection and equality at the point of Christ's physical impairment. Christ's disfigured side bears witness to the existence of hidden disabilities as well." Iceland launches a really powerful kind of critique of those that would see God as on the side of the super able. She actually has an image in her book of God in a sit-puff wheelchair, where your only movement is through breath, where you suck on a straw-like device to move the wheelchair. And she says in this image, the disabled God is not the omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither is it pitiful or a suffering servant. She said God is survivor. And she said this God is a God that spoke to her. She says that by thinking of disability in the Bible and theology, rather than in need of cure, but actually more part of God's very identity and the Christian community's identity and experience, she said that this can empower and collaborate with individuals and groups of people with disability who struggle for justice in concrete situations, to create new ways and symbols that reclaim a hidden history in religion and in the presence of God. And I think her book is very, very powerful in thinking about how theology has prized ability over disability. And she says that new religious images, new values, new ideas about disability are central, and we need to find those in the experiences of ordinary lives. She says without them, barriers that people with disabilities encounter, while maybe lowered, they will never be fully demolished. So she really urges biblical interpreters and Christian theology to revisit their traditions.
Yeah, I'm watching a webinar.
I have two examples of interpreters that do a similar thing from their experience of disability. And the first one is related to blindness. And I've mentioned him, it was John Hull. He was a professor of New Testament studies here in the UK, in the University of Birmingham. He acquired blindness when he was 40. So he'd lived as a sighted person. He'd read the texts of the Gospels as a sighted person. And he said it was only when he acquired blindness in midlife that he actually felt that, or he actually experienced the Gospels as very sight-centric. And he offers what he calls a letter to a sighted saviour. And he's very critical of the ways in which metaphors of light and darkness, blindness and sight are throughout the kind of New Testament narratives. He's also critical of the sort of compulsory cure that happens around blind characters within the Gospels. But he does say there is one image that he finds quite powerful in the story, and that is Jesus in the Passion narrative as a blindfolded captive who, in the Passion narrative, in the trial narrative, has a blindfold put on him. And he says, you have become in that moment, Jesus, a partner in my world, one who shares my condition. He also talks about a resurrection narrative that we get in the Gospel of Luke, where two disciples walk along the road to Emmaus, and Jesus walks unknown beside them. And the story tells us that when they go into their house and they eat a meal, Jesus breaks bread and they recognize him for the first time. But they've been sighted the whole way along the road to Emmaus. They've spent the afternoon with this person, but they don't see until there's actually that communal sharing of food. It's in community that they finally see who he is. And he says in that way, the blindness related to not seeing or having knowledge is actually broken, because it's in community that people get sight. It's not just about eyes. So that's one example. Another example is from a lady called Hannah Lewis, who is a deaf priest in the Church of England. And she has written what she calls a deaf liberation theology. She has problems with the Bible as a written text, which prioritizes the spoken and the written word over sign language. And she actually says that some of the metaphors that are used around Jesus, so in the Gospel of John, Jesus is seen as introduced as the Word of God, a very literary kind of metaphor. And she wants to call him much more a sign of God, a sign of God. In the Gospel of John, Jesus does many signs. He changes water to wine. He shows himself through gesture. And she says the following: Jesus, as a sign of God rather than the word of God, is our guarantee that God wants all people, deaf and hearing, to have access to what is in God's mind for humankind, in whatever way they communicate. Jesus, sign of God, demands that whoever is presenting the good news to people must do so in a way that is understood. If we present good news in mumbled speech, then we are not only failing the deaf, we are failing to implement the will of God about communication to everybody. She also talks a lot about the ways in which gesture is used by Jesus in his ministry, touch and kind of the ways he uses earth and kind of natural objects. And we're going to see some of this tomorrow in our work together. And so she says that in many ways, Jesus can be reframed in quite a deaf-friendly way, but interpretation often misses this about him. These kinds of insights come from people interpreting text from their own experience. And the Ujamaa Centre, which Charlene is going to introduce us to now, is one of the world's, well, it is the preeminent centre of trying to developing this methodology of bringing people's experience to their context. And I'm delighted to give the floor to Charlene.
Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. Louise, thank you for the introduction and also for sort of paving the way for me to say a couple of things. I, however, brought a friend with me. I brought my colleague, TG. She will introduce herself a little bit later on. TG is also a collaborator at the Ujamaa Center, and she is currently also my honor student for all her sins. And now she is developing, she's using her own experience as an albino person to read the Bible and to think about how the Bible could be used in a productive way when thinking about albinism. So I told TG I would much rather listen to her speaking about this issue and about her engagement of the text than speak to you about it. But I promised that I would lead us in just in terms of who the Ujamaa Center is, what we do, what is our theoretical underpinnings, and how do we understand the Bible to function when we engage issues of gender and sexuality and disability and race and class. So I listened with a careful ear this morning in our discussion, because usually when I start off any sort of discussion about how the Bible is used, I ask people, so when we think about disability, how is the Bible used in your context? And due to time, we don't have now a long time to discuss these things. But as I listened this morning and just heard some of the reflections, um, I think some of the things that I picked up on is that the Bible is often used, and Louise, your example also illustrated this as almost a sanction for stigmatization. Sort of to say that I read the Bible in this way, and it's clear that the Bible has a certain positionality towards people with disability, or towards certain genders or sexual orientations. So sometimes the Bible is used in that way to sanction stigmatization. Other times, and it would be fairly interesting to hear how many of us have ever heard sermons or Bible studies engaging the topics of disability. Have you ever sat in a church where someone preached on the topic of disability? So I think when we think about this in our everyday faith context, we might come up with sort of the answer that there's a pervasive silence around issues of disability, gender, and sexuality when it comes to Bible interpretation. Um, and thirdly, I think the Bible often functions as sort of a final word in any ethical or complex discussion. So, sort of as a conversation ender to say, well, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that ends it. And it's very seldom that the Bible is used as a springboard into complex discussions. And that's exactly where the Ujamaa Center comes in. That is our claim to fame, that we are radical in our approach. We draw on Latin American liberation theology foundationally, where we say that we are using the tool of the master against the master. So you can already hear that there's a certain amount of ideology critique. So sort of thinking about serious questions that we think about is power in the process of Bible interpretation. So who gets to interpret the Bible when we think about issues of gender? I mean, there's this classic dictum of men on the pulpit, women in the pew. And when we think about the issue of disability, I think most of us would say that the dominant mode of interpretation is by able-bodied people reading the Bible for themselves to uphold the community of able-bodied people. And that's why I also started my reflection this morning with the silver spoon to say this is the sort of things that we need to interrogate and to challenge. But so we ask critical questions about who gets to interpret the Bible, and then we try to make trouble with that a little bit by using a contextual Bible reading methodology. Now, last year, the Ujamaa Center, that is based within the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. We're based in Pietermaritzburg and Durban. We had our 30th anniversary celebration for our work. And the slogan on the back of the T-shirt, because we love a T-shirt, the slogan on the back of the T-shirt, which I'm actually wearing today, was reclaiming the stolen Bible, one contextual Bible reading at a time. Now, this slogan warrants unpacking. I often get stopped in the street when I go for a run and I wear this shirt. Then people want to know, because we summarize contextual Bible study with CBS. Then people want to know, who is this stolen Bible and what is CBS? So it's a great conversation starter. And what we meant by the slogan, reclaiming the stolen Bible, is it's exactly this idea that the Bible has been stolen from people, from real people, to grapple with their own realities and to engage the biblical text. Because when we think about it, it is very often either faith leaders or pastors or ministers or the trained who get to interpret the text, or of course biblical scholars like myself and Louise, who get to say what the text really means. So the Ujamaa Center tries to say, no, we need to push back against this notion of certain people knows what the text mean and other people need to keep quiet and listen to that expert interpretation, by saying, let's listen collectively to people's interpretation of the text. And we believe that what you see in the biblical text is deeply informed by where you stand. And I think Louise already led us into this, to say the context of the reader, the one interpreting the text, deeply informs the way in which the text is interpreted. Now, for a very long time, interpretation and the value of interpretation, was valued by scholars and by church leaders. And what the Ujamaa Center tries to do is to say, let's use the Bible, this tool that's been used also to oppress us in numerous contexts. Let's use the Bible as a tool for liberation. And let's place it in the middle of our discussions as a reflective surface. And this is a little theory that we've come up with and that we've journeyed with, where we said that sometimes when people engage the Bible, when they approach the Bible, they think it's like a magic book that gives you all the answers. Now, if you read some of those difficult texts that Louise already referred to, it's very clear that if you were to take that as your ready-made answers to life, it will lead to the exclusion and violence and pain for so many people. So Bible interpretation clearly needs a level of critique and critical engagement. We can't just, when I used to be a pastor in my previous life, every Sunday when I went onto the pulpit, I said to my congregation colleagues and friends, this book wasn't written yesterday and faxed and pushed underneath our door here in Cape Town or wherever we stay. It was written thousands of years ago, and it developed in complex communities who tried to navigate survival in their own places. And therefore, we need to come to this text critically. And the theory we make use of is the Bible as a reflective surface. So what we say is that it's complicated stories, right? It's messy stories, it's painful stories, often very violent stories. But what happens is when we use the Bible, or when we appropriate the Bible as a reflective surface, we use those narratives and those stories as ways to reflect back to ourselves lived realities and complex realities. Because what we have found, and especially in our work around gender-based violence, is that it's much easier for people to talk about the family of David, right? That classic story that we find in 2 Samuel 13, the rape of Tamar by her half brother Amnon. We sort of found that people have got much more to say about the story of that biblical family and of what's going on in that community than it is for them to speak about their own lived realities. So we'd much rather speak about Amnon and about the complexity of that family than we would speak about our own communities and the own complexities within our communities. So we believe that it's important. So if we think about the model that underlies contextual Bible study, it's sort of a critique of this classic. And any of you who's thought a little bit about Bible interpretation, there's this classic model of there's an author, there's a text, and there's an interpreter. And this is sort of 101 Bible study sort of thing. So we need to think about the world behind the text and the world of the author. We need to think of the world of the text, so the Bible as a book in itself, and then we need to think about the reader. But for a very long time, no one was really so concerned about the reader. They were sort of an afterthought in Bible interpretation processes and scholarship. And then people started to think, wow, no, but people like Stanley Fish, a radical reader response, said, you know, the Bible doesn't exist without an interpreter. If there's not someone sitting in front of the text, then nothing happens. But this classic model of author, text, interpreter is sometimes misunderstood as a singular line, you know, and the reader is often conceptualized, still even in scholarship, as a singular reader. And what the Ujamaa Center tries to theoretically bring to the table is to say, we believe that there's a multiplicity of readers around the text. And this is the truth, right? All of us come to the text. I remember in my undergraduate biblical studies, my professors always said, you come to the Bible with a certain spectacle, right? Your spectacles determine what you see. That lens is your lens, and it's informed by where you stand and what you think and what you've lived in your life. So the Ujamaa Center taps onto this and says, yes, it is definitely so that where you stand determines what you see. And therefore, we need to be very serious about the context of the reader and the interpretive skills that readers, in the multiple sense of the word, bring to the interpretation process. It's not only biblical scholars and pastors who has got something to say about the Bible. Our embodied lived experiences informs our interpretation, and this could be the greatest gift that we bring to the process of Bible interpretation. So if we the Ujamaa Center has spent a lot of time, and we're deeply indebted to our now retired colleague, Professor Gerald West, who's done great theoretical work around the process, and there's a young generation of scholars, new scholars, who's tapping onto his work and who's starting to think about it. But he wrote this little definition for contextual Bible study. He says contextual Bible study is a collaborative post-colonial praxis. So it takes seriously the embodied positions of those where they are situated, in which the already present Bible is reread communally and critically. So we read it together. It's not me sitting there in my own little corner and reading the Bible. We read it together. We draw on the local interpretive resources of particularly organized communities of the poor and the marginalized. Ordinary, he calls it, and people have thought with him for long hours about this term, the ordinary readers of the Bible, but that is everyone who comes to the text. And the critical interpretive resources of socially engaged, biblical and theologically trained readers. So what the process tries to do, it also tries to bring in conversation critical readers of the text, so biblical scholars and those who've been trained in reading the Bible, and then so-called ordinary readers of the Bible. And what is the point of this coming together and reading the Bible together? Working together, he says, for systemic, social, and theological transformation. So always when I teach contextual Bible study, or when I engage this with students, or with workshops with pastors, I always say, colleagues, if you don't want anything to change in your congregation, if you find it nice, and if you find everything great as it is, then don't use contextual Bible reading as a methodology. Because if you allow people, if you are brave enough to allow people to come to the process of Bible interpretation, something magical happens there. And people become collaborators in this process of meaning making and sense making. And the point of this process is, of course, to bring change and liberation, especially for those who are poor or marginalized or disenfranchised. So when the Ujamaa Center thinks about contextual Bible study, there's these 5 sort of key theoretical insights that we bring to the table. And here we are indebted to our very creative colleague, Professor Sarojini Nadar, who's currently based at the University of the Western Cape in the Desmond Tutu chair. She came up with the 5 C's because she's very clever like that. The 5 C's of contextual Bible study. She says, firstly, it is an interactive community. It's reading the Bible in the community with others. Secondly, it takes seriously the social location or the context of the reader. So the second C is context. It brings to this process, thirdly, the context of the Bible by using critical tools. So thirdly, it is critical. The 4th C and the aim of contextual Bible study is to conscientize, is to make aware. So the Ujamaa Center only partners organizations and communities who invite us, and we consider our job to travel with communities, to sit with communities, and to offer some resources in order to journey towards liberation for those communities. It's not, we don't come up with the liberation. We don't say, oh, this is what it looks like when a community flourished. We try to journey with communities to say, you as a community of poor or marginalized or women or survivors of gender-based violence or sexually diverse people, how do you see yourself flourishing? And how can we use biblical resources to enable this process? And then the final C is for transformative change. Point of contextual Bible study is to bring change, and this is also something that we get a lot of critique for, because we have got a certain ideological investment. We don't come to the process of Bible interpretation. We don't pretend to be objective or innocent in our approach. Our approach is very much focused towards the liberation of those who are poor, marginalized, and disenfranchised. So, okay, that's the case. How do we do it? And I'm going to ask TG to illustrate it to us. I'm just going to lead us into maybe say something of the sort of movement that we see within contextual Bible study. So remember, right in the beginning, I spoke about the Latin American See Judge Act. So seeing, which is a contextual analysis, intersectional contextual analysis. See, I'm looking what is going on in my landscape. Then judge. In the judge moment, I draw on my faith resources, my history of interpretation, my interpretation of the Bible, doctrine, reason, my own understanding. So judge. And then act, and always to enable faith communities to act in a positive way, to make change. So the See, Judge, Act methodology. And how this falls out in our Bible studies is we say that there's certain consciousnesses that we tap into. We say we start with the consciousness of a community in the See. We want to tap into the knowledge of bodies living in community. So community consciousness that moves into critical consciousness, where we engage the biblical text, always to come back to community consciousness in order to make change and to impact a landscape of inequality. So if we think about classical biblical interpretation sort of language, we start from the world in front of the text, the world of the reader's engagement with the text, to the world of the text and behind the text, because as TG will also show, we draw on the insights of critical biblical scholarship in order to engage issues. And then we come back to the world in front of the text in order to help the reader to use this insights from reading the Bible collectively in order to make change. Now, from the example that TG will share with you, you will note something very clearly. The point of the process is not to give people answers. That's not our job. We don't see ourselves as experts on reading the Bible, and then we come to your community and we give you a handbook and we say, okay, this is how life works. That's not the point of it. The fundamental point of contextual Bible study is to give a reflective surface that enables complicated conversations. So the sort of stuff that's been coming out of our conversation today has been understanding disability as sin, uh, thinking about the complex nature of healing. A number of these sort of general concerns when we think about disability and navigating disability in our contextual settings is things that we tap into in our construction of a contextual Bible study in order to enable complicated, sometimes heated, sometimes very difficult conversations. And our challenge to faith communities and interpreters of the Bible is to say, we are challenging you to lean into discomfort. It's not easy. It's not a fun afternoon to do a contextual Bible study. It's hard work of slow, critical rereading of the text. But we believe that this leaning into discomfort brings us to the potential of liberation. And I'm going to ask TG to share some of her work that she's developing for her honors. I saved her Bible study in my file for her honors this morning. So TG, please share with us your work and the way in which you've read the story of in John chapter 9.
All right. Afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Tando Gasa. As Charlene says, I am called TG because it's easier that way with my name and surname. Although Prof. Van der Walt accuses me of reading the wrong side of the Bible, but it's all right. As an Old Testament scholar, I know, but this is where I'd like to start navigating this conversation. Just a brief in background about myself. I'm a person living with albinism. Growing up in the South African context, I'm lucky to say that it hasn't been as difficult as in the other African countries from what we've been reading and what we've also been hearing. But there have been elements of a lot of discrimination, a lot of myths that have gone around, and things that people had to try and learn and unlearn about understanding people with albinism. And also sometimes in relation to people with disability, because also albinism has been branched under the disability wing because of the visual impairment. So part of my experience has been that part of the discrimination and being able to try and grow and find myself and be able to identify myself in the context where I'm living and in the community where I'm living. And hence, maybe that also pushed me to be a social justice activist as well in part of the development sector, just trying to make a voice and trying to change people's thoughts and navigate ourselves into, let's have conversations about things we don't understand. Hence, also with this Bible reading that we're going to do. So my contextual Bible study is on the book of John 9, verses 1 to 10. So my C, as Charlene has explained, it's in terms of seeing being the context and of what are we looking at. So my question that I just thought of tackling is, how are people living with albinism treated in our community, and how has religious or culture reinforced this? So that will be our C, whereby in the C is where in that community, we speak about what is happening in that community. What are the things that are actually happening? Because as much as we might have an understanding, just general, but it's always easier to look at from the point of the context, the direct context that we are in. So that will cover our C. Then moving to the judge, where we begin to interrogate the text. So basically what happens here is we read the text. One person will read the text, and in most cases, if we are in a community where there are different languages, we might get different versions of the text in the different languages so that everybody is comfortable and everybody has a sense of ownership. As Charlene has said, we are trying to move the stolen Bible back to the people. So in order for us to give it back to the people is for the people to feel like they have a sense of ownership in what they are doing. So to become part of the process, we will use different versions or different languages of the Bible text so that everybody is on board. So after the text has been read about once or twice from different people, then we move to the first question, which kind of just lays the foundation, would be about what is the text about? That's just giving a broad understanding of what the text is about, and maybe also just gauging what are people understanding about it. What are the characters? Who are the characters, sorry? And what is known about them? That's also just laying a bit of a foundation, which is leading us from the context of community as well, because we are still in moving from the C Judge Act methodology. So that kind of forms, in a way, a bit of community consciousness of who is in that community of the text that we are speaking of. Then when we move slightly into the critical consciousness of the text, that's when we start to delve a bit more in terms of what exactly about the text are we trying to talk about, and where we start to ask some of the questions. So my other question is, what is what can be noted about the blind man in verse 1? So in verse 1, that is where this story of the blind man is where the text explains to us in terms of the man was born with his blindness. So that is just to create the foundation of understanding that for us also with disability or with albinism is the notion of that it is something that you're born with. Yes, there are cases where there is a disability where a person becomes disabled through an action, but or an injury or medical. But in most cases, most people are born with their disability. And in my case with albinism, it's something that I'm born with. So then we look at the next question of how can we relate verse 1 to people living with albinism. Here is where, as I'm saying, is the notion that this albinism is something that you're born with. So with the blind man as well, he was born with his blindness. So that's where we start to navigate the world of the text to say, this is the situation right now that we are facing in this world of the text. All right. Question 5 is, what can verses 2 and 3 show us in our understanding of people living with albinism? Here, that is where the disciples ask Jesus in terms of, Rabbi, who has sinned between the blind man or his parents? Which is, in most cases, when something is considered not the norm per se, there will always be a question of who has wronged or who has gone to do the wrong. So even with being born with albinism, even in the cultural context, there are people, because there's no understanding and not knowing what exactly went wrong per se with this child who is born different from their parents. So the question of who was wrong or who had sinned, that is the discourse for people. It's easier to find the answers, especially in our religious community, in the answer of sin, to say somebody has sinned and this is a punishment from God, in a sense, to get this child with a disability or this child with albinism because somebody has sinned. So here, that is the same notion of sin. But at the same time, um, in the same text in verse 3, that's when Jesus actually affirms to say, no, nobody has actually sinned. Between the two, nobody has sinned. This is just how this person is born, and making us reach to the point of acknowledging that we are all born differently and differently abled in our makeup. So whoever is born with a disability, with albinism, you are born that way, and that is how God created you, beginning to us to also challenge the image of God, to say the image of God comes in different forms, because the image of God has always been seen as this perfect image of likeness to him. So in this sense, if a person has technically a defect, that would be seen as not an image of God. But here, Jesus is reinforcing to say, this is actually an image of God, and nowhere in this image of God should there be a blame or a sin because of this being a punishment. Then we move to what is the significance of verses 6 to 7 in relation to people with albinism. Um, so here is where Jesus begins the process of healing for this blind man. He uses mud to cover his eyes, and he's sent to go and wash in the river so that he can be cleansed and be healed. And in this notion is where we'd like to start the conversation of, is it possible to heal some of these disabilities or this albinism that one is born with? Because it's a skin condition, it's a genetic condition that it cannot be changed. I have no pigment in my skin, and no amount of prayer can heal that for me. And also the notion of why do we then assume that because a person is in my case, albinism, a person is different. They are not healthy, or they are not in the right image, as I said before, the image of God. So here we begin to challenge the critical consciousness of the community to say, what exactly about this is maybe the wrong? Because in most cases, the conversation starters are those difficult questions that we push people to begin to critically think about things you've always internalized and things you've always said, oh no, but this is like this because of this. But hence, it does not always happen that way. And in most cases, some of these things are medical, and they've found medical reasoning for it. But at the same time, you'd find that some conditions cannot be medically corrected. So that does not mean that this can be something that can be healed or can be medically corrected. So this is where we're pushing the conversation and beginning these questions of interrogation. Then we move to back slightly towards now the act. So in my act portion, we begin to look at in verses 8 and 9, what lessons can one take from this man with regards to those living with albinism? So here we talk about the community sees this man coming from the river, and everybody's looking at him, thinking, is it him? Is it not him? We've known this man, we've seen him begging, we've seen him in our community. So as people with albinism, as people with disability, have been in the community, we have been living amongst the other people, but it's always been considered okay for them to sit and beg, for them to be out of the economic sphere, which also begins to touch on also economic injustice and socio-economic injustice, because it's easier to give him a 1 rand, to give him food, but never to try and engage with him as a member of a community, never try to understand and have a conversation about exactly how is he living, how are you living, how are you coping in this community. So here the issue of action, about some of the actions that we do, but also some of the critical questions that we need to begin to think about as community in our way of action is, how do we change the situation? How do we look at people differently? In many countries, especially like here in South Africa, we have a disability grant for people living with disability. So there's that notion that maybe that grant is one of the ways to help and aid people, but also bearing in mind that there are people who actually can go out, get a job and be a contributor in the economic sphere, in the working world. So not everybody needs to start in the place of grant. First, let's try and see, can we not educate? Can we not get the people into the world of work before we can move on to something? And then part of the act also is, what actions can we begin to take as a community in making a change as how people with albinism are treated, or how people with disability are treated? So these two, as I said before, form part of the action question. And with the See Judge Act method is, in that particular community who has invited us, you are willing, or you are the one looking to make a change. So when we come through, we run the Bible study to say, let's have the conversations. Let's begin to ask some of these questions. And as Charlene has said, there are no answers that I have given, but it's answers that come from the floor. And from the floor is when we start also collectively beginning to think, let's chart a way forward as to what actions can we take, which then also speaks to us as Ujamaa Center in what support, or how can we support these actions. And at times it might not need directly us to be a part, but maybe a referral to a person or a network partner that can help to charter the support or the action. But the whole point is moving from the place of uh, creating a consciousness about what is happening, what do we want to do, and how do we see ourselves moving forward. Thank you very much.